Right now, somewhere in your brain, there is a small, quiet mechanism trying to convince you of a lie. It's telling you that when you blocked their number, when you stopped responding to the messages, when you finally cut the cord, they collapsed. It's telling you that they are sitting in a quiet room somewhere, staring at a blank screen, finally feeling the crushing weight of what they lost. You want to believe that your absence was the precise instrument that cut through their armor. Here is the cold, physiological truth. It didn't. When you go no contact with a narcissist, you aren't ending a relationship in their mind. You are breaking a behavioral contract they believed you signed for life. And the moment that contract breaks, their brain enters a very specific, highly predictable neurological state. If you've ever watched a human being process a sudden loss of control, you know it doesn't start with sadness. It starts with calibration. In the first 48 hours, they aren't missing you. They are running diagnostic checks on your environment. They are scanning your social media through burner accounts, analyzing the exact cadence of your posts, looking for micro indicators of distress. They aren't looking for love. They are looking for leakage. They want to see if your decision is a temporary emotional spike or a structural shift. If it's a temporary spike, they wait. If it's a structural shift, the mask doesn't just slip, it dissolves. Most people misinterpret this phase entirely. They mistake silence for peace. But silence from a narcissist after you cut them off isn't surrender, it's weaponized observation. They are calculating your threshold for guilt, mapping out which mutual connection is most likely to act as a Trojan horse, and testing which specific psychological trigger will force a micro-reaction out of you. The most dangerous moment isn't when they rage. The most dangerous moment is the quiet period right before they attempt their first covert re-entry. Because if you don't understand the exact psychological sequence they execute during no contact, you will mistake their desperate attempt at control for genuine human remorse. And the moment you give them a single inch of access, the cycle doesn't reset, it accelerates. By the end of this breakdown, you are going to understand the precise mechanics of what happens behind closed doors when a narcissist realizes you aren't coming back. You will see the exact stages of their internal panic, why their behavior becomes hyper-calculated, and the single most critical psychological rule you must follow if you want to remain entirely out of their reach. There is a moment, usually occurring around 2 a.m., when someone who has cut contact sits in the dark and asks themselves, are they thinking about me? Do they realize what they did? If you take only one thing away from our time together today, let it be this. The answer to that question is yes, but not for the reason your empathy wants you to believe. If you leave before we unpack the full framework today, you will continue to view their behavior through the lens of standard human emotion, leaving you wide open to the exact tactical hoovering methods designed to pull you back in. Watch this all the way through, because by the time we reach the final principle, you will have an unshakable operational model for their entire post-disengagement playbook, and you will never look at their silence the same way again. When you execute no contact, you remove their primary source of external regulation. A narcissist does not hold a stable internal identity. They rely entirely on feedback loops from their environment to maintain their ego structure. When you sever that loop, you create a vacuum. Initially, they process your absence as a temporary glitch. They expect you to break. They rely on the psychological dynamic of intermittent reinforcement, the variable reward schedule they spent months or years conditioning into your neural pathways. They assume the anxiety of separation will eventually force you to seek closure. When that closure request doesn't arrive, panic sets in. But panic in a narcissistic structure doesn't look like tears. It looks like strategic maneuverability. Phase 1. Low-stakes probing. You receive a text about a forgotten item of zero value, or an accidental dial at 1 a.m. They are testing the perimeter. Phase 2. The narrative shift. If the probe fails, the smear campaign initiates. They must regain control of the room, even if you aren't in it. They position themselves as the injured party to recruit secondary allies. Phase 3. The Extinction Burst. Behavior escalates. Provocations become sharp, direct, or seemingly urgent. This is the baseline spike right before a behavioral pattern dies out. The painful truth is that a narcissist doesn't miss you. They miss the predictability of your reactions. The moment you achieve true emotional neutrality, where their rage doesn't spike your adrenaline and their quiet doesn't trigger your guilt, the connection is broken permanently. Total freedom isn't making them understand what they lost. It's rendering their presence completely irrelevant to your survival. When you execute no contact, you operate under the assumption that you have cut off a relationship. But in the mental architecture of a narcissist, relationships as you understand them do not exist. What exists is a complex, carefully calibrated network of external inputs designed to stabilize a deeply fragmented sense of self. Your presence, your emotional responsiveness, your outrage, and even your attempt to reason with them were never viewed as expressions of human connection. They were baseline metrics of control. Therefore, when you suddenly go dark, their brain does not register the emotional weight of heartbreak, longing, or remorse. It registers a critical system failure. To understand this dynamic, you have to look at how a narcissist maintains psychological equilibrium. Because they lack a stable, internally generated sense of self-worth, they rely entirely on external validation, micro-reactions, and authority over their immediate environment to keep their internal instability at bay. You were a foundational pillar of that stabilization system. When you sever communication, you aren't leaving a partner, you are dismantling their control apparatus without warning. The immediate neurological response to this isn't grief, it is hypervigilance. They enter a state of active diagnostic assessment. In the immediate aftermath of your departure, their primary objective is to determine whether your silence represents a real threat to their control or merely a temporary emotional outburst. They run quiet, methodical diagnostic checks on your behavior. They monitor the subtle shifts in your digital footprint, gauge the distance between you and shared acquaintances, and look for any indicator that suggests you are in emotional distress. Why? Because your distress is proof that the connection remains intact. If you are angry, hurting, or actively trying to process the pain they caused, you are still actively engaged in the feedback loop. Your pain confirms that they still hold the power to dictate your internal state. The paradox lies in how everyday human empathy misinterprets this diagnostic phase. Most people who go no contact expect an immediate display of emotion, either intense remorse or explosive anger. When neither materializes, or when the response feels strangely hollow and calculated, the victim begins to second-guess their reality. They wonder if the narcissist simply didn't care at all, or if they were so easily forgotten. But silence is not indifference, and calculation is not peace. The absence of an immediate emotional collapse isn't proof that they moved on. It is proof that their primary drive is the preservation of power rather than the preservation of a bond. They do not ask themselves what they did wrong, nor do they reflect on the boundaries you set. Their internal narrative immediately shifts to risk management and authority recovery. They evaluate how your exit impacts their social standing, their access to resources, and their perceived dominance over the dynamic. The entire focus remains entirely external. If they do attempt early contact, it is rarely a grand gesture of love. It is a low-energy probe intended to test the tension on the line, designed to answer one specific question. Does my input still produce a predictable output in their central nervous system? When you recognize that their initial reaction is entirely rooted in diagnostic control rather than emotional loss, the illusion shatters. You realize that holding out hope for a breakthrough, an apology, or a moment of genuine self-reflection is attempting to extract an emotion from a process that is purely operational. Their reaction to your absence is not about who you were to them. It is about what your independence threatens to reveal about the fragility of their control. When the diagnostic phase fails to yield an immediate result, the narcissist shifts strategies. This brings us to the mechanics of the intermittent Hoover cycle, a calculated transition from passive observation to active, low-stakes probing. You must understand that when your initial silence holds firm, the narcissist experiences a distinct neurological frustration. The predictable loop of emotional feedback has broken, and their immediate objective becomes forcing a micro-response from you to re-establish an emotional baseline. They do not need a full reconciliation at this stage. They merely need proof of concept. They need to verify that your central nervous system still responds to their specific frequency of provocation. To accomplish this, they deploy low-stakes probes carefully designed to bypass your logical defenses while targeting your residual sense of obligation, curiosity, or guilt. These probes are rarely overt or grand romantic gestures, because a grand gesture carries a high risk of outright rejection, which their fragile ego structure cannot tolerate. Instead, they utilize plausible deniability. You might receive a plain text message asking about an inconsequential forgotten item, a brief accidental misdial late at night, or a forward of a meme you once shared together, accompanied by a zero-context question mark. On the surface, these actions appear innocuous, almost casual. But from a behavioral standpoint, they are highly precise psychological instruments. The psychological mechanics behind this approach rely on the principle of variable reward schedules, or intermittent reinforcement. Throughout the course of the relationship, your brain was systematically conditioned to react to unpredictable patterns of attention, tension, and relief. The narcissist understands this conditioning, whether consciously or instinctively. By sending a low-stakes probe, they are pressing a button that previously guaranteed a flood of adrenaline, anxiety, or confusion in your system. If you respond, even if that response is cold, angry, or brief, you have provided the exact output they were looking for. An angry, "Stop texting me," is not a boundary to a narcissist. It is a confirmation that they still hold the remote control to your emotional state. If the first low-stakes probe fails to elicit a reply, the nature of the Hoover evolves. They will systematically adjust the variable, moving from benign casualness to artificial urgency or engineered vulnerability. You might hear through a mutual connection that they are experiencing a minor crisis, or they may send a message that subtly hints at a medical concern or financial setback. This is a deliberate exploitation of your empathy. They know that your default psychological setting is helpfulness and compassion, and they attempt to leverage those exact traits to pull you back into the conversational loop. They create a scenario where remaining silent makes you feel like the cruel or unreasonable party, effectively flipping the moral dynamic of the breakup. The danger of this phase lies in its quiet persistence. Because these interactions lack the obvious toxicity of an open argument, your brain can easily rationalize lowering your guard. You tell yourself that answering a simple logistical question is harmless, or that acknowledging a crisis is just basic human decency. But the moment you grant a single inch of access, the cycle does not remain polite. The micro-response acts as a green light, signaling to the narcissist that the line of control is still live. The moment access is re-established, the low-stakes probing ceases, and the underlying dynamics of manipulation, boundary erosion, and psychological dominance immediately begin to reclaim lost ground. When the low-stakes probes fall flat and fail to breach your perimeter, the narcissist faces a terrifying reality. They have lost direct access to your nervous system. In the psychological framework of a narcissist, the total loss of direct influence over a target creates an immediate exposure crisis. If they can no longer manipulate your perception of them, They must immediately pivot to controlling how everyone else perceives both you and the demise of the relationship. This is where the mechanics of the smear campaign activate, transforming what was once a private dynamic into an orchestrated campaign of reputational defense and social isolation. To understand the smear campaign, you must realize that it is almost never a reactive outburst of anger. It is a preemptive strike born out of extreme psychological self-preservation. The narcissist operates under an intense fear that you will speak the unvarnished truth about what happened behind closed doors. Because their entire identity relies on a carefully constructed facade of superiority, virtue, or victimhood, the threat of your narrative gaining traction is intolerable. Therefore, they move to rewrite the story before you even have the opportunity to tell yours. They do not wait for the truth to emerge. They engineer a counter-narrative designed to render your potential testimony entirely invalid in the eyes of your shared social circle. The primary objective of this phase is twofold: securing secondary sources of psychological validation and systematically isolating you from external support systems. To achieve this, the narcissist adopts the role of the injured party. They deploy an insidious mix of half-truths, inverted timelines, and selective disclosures to mutual friends, family members, or colleagues. They take moments where you reacted to their chronic abuse, your raised voice, your tears, your sudden boundary setting, and present those isolated reactions out of context as proof of your instability, toxicity, or unprovoked cruelty. By framing your enforce of no contact as an act of cold, heartless abandonment, they successfully secure sympathy while subtly painting you as the villain. This manipulation relies heavily on recruiting what psychologists term flying monkeys, individuals within your shared network who are unknowingly weaponized to carry out the narcissist's agenda. These third parties are fed subtle concerns wrapped in fake empathy. The narcissist might say things like, "I'm just really worried about them, they've completely changed," or "I tried everything to save us, but their behavior became too toxic." Unaware of the underlying abuse, these well-meaning or easily manipulated individuals absorb the false narrative and begin to do the narcissist's work for them. They may approach you under the guise of offering help, subtly pressure you to reconcile, or report your reactions back to the narcissist, effectively extending the narcissist's surveillance apparatus into your life despite your block lists. By controlling the external narrative, the narcissist builds an emotional buffer that protects their fragile ego from the uncomfortable reality of your departure. If everyone around them agrees that you were the problem, the narcissist can safely dismiss your departure as a personal failing on your part rather than a direct consequence of their abusive behavior. The smear campaign ensures that even in your complete absence, your ghost is utilized as a tool to fuel their continuous need for attention, pity, and moral superiority. They turn your silence into evidence against you, ensuring that the social structure surrounding you becomes hostile or fractured, effectively punishing you for daring to break free from their control. When direct probing fails and the smear campaign yields diminishing psychological returns, the narcissist enters the most volatile stage of the no-contact timeline, the extinction burst. In behavioral psychology, an extinction burst refers to the predictable, temporary spike in the frequency, intensity, and variety of an unwanted behavior right before that behavior completely dies out. Think of a child slamming the button on a broken vending machine with escalating violence when the machine stops dispensing candy. The narcissist has relied on a specific set of tools for months or years to elicit your emotional output. When those tools suddenly yield complete radio silence, their psychological system experiences severe distress, prompting one final, explosive attempt to break your boundaries and reclaim control over the narrative. During this phase, the covert, calculated maneuvers of the past completely evaporate, replaced by overt, high-intensity actions designed to bypass your logical filters entirely. The narcissist realizes that subtle tactics are no longer working, so they escalate the stakes to force an immediate fight or flight response within your central nervous system. This escalation can take many forms, ranging from dramatic declarations of desperate love and existential crises to terrifying outbursts of rage, threats of legal action, or physical appearances in your personal space. The goal is no longer to convince you of anything. The goal is to trigger an emotional overload so intense that your discipline snaps and you send a single message, make a single call, or step out to confront them directly. What makes the extinction burst particularly dangerous is its complete lack of restraint. The narcissist's fragile ego structure is facing total collapse because your sustained silence acts as an unyielding mirror reflecting their complete powerlessness. To escape that internal void, they will leverage your deepest vulnerabilities, secrets you entrusted to them, or your core values against you. They may fabricate severe emergencies, make sudden promises of profound structural change, or level extreme false accusations against your character in spaces where you feel compelled to defend yourself. Every action taken during an extinction burst is a high-stakes gamble designed to force your system out of indifference and back into a state of reactive engagement. It is critical to recognize that this surge in activity is not a sign of overwhelming love, nor is it proof that they have suddenly realized your worth. It is a manifestation of deep psychological panic resulting from a total loss of authority. When an individual who has conditioned you to obey or react suddenly loses that authority, their immediate instinct is to amplify the noise until you submit. If you misinterpret this frantic behavior as genuine remorse or a sign that the relationship can be salvaged, you enter back into the cycle at a point where the abuse dynamic will inevitably worsen, as the narcissist will seek to punish you for pushing them to such an absolute breaking point. Surviving the extinction burst requires absolute operational discipline and an unshakable understanding of behavioral mechanics. Every attempt to provoke you, whether through tears, threats, false accusations, or desperate grand gestures, is simply fuel being burned in a dying behavioral engine. The intensity of the burst is actually direct, measurable evidence that your boundaries are working and that their influence over your life is reaching its absolute end. If you maintain total silence throughout this chaotic storm, the surge will eventually run out of momentum, forcing the narcissistic structure to abandon the attempt and look elsewhere for external validation. Once the storm of the extinction burst clears and the narcissist realizes that no level of provocation, manipulation, or synthetic crisis will reopen the line of communication, the final shift occurs. This brings us to the ultimate operational reality of post-disengagement: permanent detachment dynamics. For the survivor of narcissistic abuse, this stage represents the complete transition from active defense to unshakable emotional neutrality. It is the phase where you stop monitoring their movements, stop decoding their behavior, and fundamentally realize that true freedom is not the presence of righteous anger or the satisfaction of revenge, but the total, quiet absence of emotional investment. To understand permanent detachment, you must first dismantle the illusion of what winning against a narcissist looks like. Many people enter the no-contact process holding a secret hope that their silence will act as a silent punishment, eventually forcing the narcissist to experience a devastating revelation of regret. But as long as you hold on to the hope for their collapse, their remorse, or their acknowledgement of your pain, you are still bound to their psychological framework. Anger, resentment, and the desire to see them face consequences are all high-energy emotional tether points. To a narcissist, even your bitter hatred is proof that they still possess real estate inside your central nervous system. Indifference, the absolute zero of emotional investment, is the only state that breaks the tethers entirely. Achieving permanent detachment requires a fundamental shift in how you process the past. You stop viewing the narcissist as a complex emotional puzzle that needs to be solved, or a broken person who just needed the right kind of love. Instead, you view them through a clear, objective behavioral lens. You recognize that their patterns are entirely predictable, entirely transactional, and fundamentally incapable of hosting genuine human reciprocity. When this cognitive shift takes hold, their microprobes, their lingering smear campaigns, and their attempts to construct a perfect life on social media completely lose their power to affect your baseline state. They simply become background noise, irrelevant to your day-to-day existence. This absolute neutrality acts as an impenetrable shield against future Hoover attempts. When a narcissist attempts to re-enter the sphere of someone who has achieved total detachment, they encounter an environment that offers no emotional friction whatsoever. There is no anger to feed on, no guilt to exploit, and no curiosity to leverage. The line is not just busy, the entire infrastructure has been decommissioned. Finding zero emotional output to harvest, the narcissist system naturally redirects its focus toward path of least resistance elsewhere. They move on not because they have evolved, but because your complete lack of reactivity makes you entirely useless to their ongoing need for external regulation. Ultimately, permanent detachment is an internal reclamation project. It is the moment you reclaim the massive amount of cognitive energy previously spent anticipating their moods, managing their crises, and defending your reality against their gaslighting. You redirect that energy inward, rebuilding your own agency, your own boundaries, and your own life structure. You no longer define your safety by how far away they are, but by how grounded you are in your own truth. The painful journey of going no contact comes to a quiet, powerful end, leaving you with the profound realization that their presence, their absence, and their opinion of you no longer have any bearing on who you are.